මට ඇත්තටම අපේ මගේ දරුවෝ බඩගිනි අම්මා කියනකොට මට දෙන්න දෙයක් නැහැ නේ සර්. ඒ හින්දා තමයි මම ওই ණය ගත්තේ. මේ මගේ කුඹුරේ විසල් තුනක් තිබ්බා. මම කුඹුරත් බදු කස් තියලා ඒවත් ඒ ණයමයි ගෙව්වේ. අද මට කුඹුරුත් නැහැ. පුදුම පිපාතයකට වැටලා තියෙන්නේ. ගෙවා ගන්න බැරි වුණොත් මගේ ජීවිතේ මම ඇත්තටම නැති කරගන්න මට්ටමේ තමයි මම නම් හිතාගෙන ඉන්නේ.
What you're missing out is to ask the larger questions. Why are women borrowing? What compels women to actually borrow even when they know that the interest rates are extremely high? Women told us themselves, yes, but we cannot stop borrowing. People tell us to stop borrowing. But then there are these other needs in the family that I have to respond to, that I have to.
Microfinance is not something new to Sri Lanka. Of late, however, questions have been raised regarding the demerits of such financial services, not only on the financial burden placed on rural communities, but also the social issues with major repercussions. Why has microfinance, which was initially introduced as a tool to alleviate poverty, now become a burden instead? Defined as provision of financial services to low-income people, microfinance services were designed to reach excluded customers, usually poorer, marginalized and geographically isolated segments, to help them become self-sufficient. Microfinance has existed in various forms for centuries and even longer in Asia. However, the birth of modern microfinance is said to have occurred in the mid-1970s in rural Bangladesh, with the Grameen Bank project led by social entrepreneur Dr. Muhammad Yunus. In 2006, Yunus and the Grameen Bank were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to create economic and social development through microcredit.
I think credit should be treated as a human right.
Inspired by the success of the Grameen Bank, the 1970s and 80s saw rapid growth in the number of new microfinance institutions appearing around the world. It also emerged as an effective tool for financing micro-entrepreneurs to alleviate poverty. Of late, however, the expansion of the microfinance sector has simultaneously given rise to concerns about mounting debt and the inability of poor women to settle their debt.
Basically, microfinance is understood as consisting of three components. There's the saving component, then there is the credit component, and the last one is the insurance component. And what we generally do is to confuse microcredit with microfinance. What generally is supposed to happen as microfinance is understood is that there is this process whereby people are first encouraged to save money for themselves. And the idea is that because now you have some savings, you can borrow, and then that the borrowing would allow you to earn some kind of a wage, or say some kind of a income for yourself and for your family. If there's a crop destruction or there is a natural disaster, that they are also then provided some form of micro insurance. So then all these three products are generally supposed to work in a very natural and way where you progress from one to the other, or they could work together. But what I want to stress is that in the Sri Lankan case, what we are seeing is that savings and the insurance components are generally not practiced. Women borrow for consumption. Women borrow in order to meet their social obligations, which are in a way not generating an income.
The problem is in different parts. So the economy is one issue. If the economy is insufficiently performing or is not able to provide adequate jobs. The second side of it is that as a borrower, you are taking the loan not necessarily for income generation, but for your consumption purposes. And the third side of it, the providers are not verifying sufficiently in order to see whether this person has the capacity to pay and is taking.
To its proponents, microfinance is seen as a viable strategy to uplift the poor. Critics, however, argue that the microcredit sector is increasing its debt by incentivizing unsustainable levels of borrowing. A recent study conducted by the Center for Poverty Analysis reveals that the fundamental principles of microfinance are eroding in the face of high competition among microfinance lenders. On the other hand, borrowers are also exploiting the system by misusing the funds, claiming that those funds are used for investment purposes.
Microcredit should be taken for business purposes. I mean, that's the basic idea. What we were finding was that it was being taken for business, supposedly for business purposes, but was being used for consumption or other purposes. We were also seeing in various instances is that people were taking other additional loans in order to pay it back. People need this money. I mean, people are not borrowing for the sake of borrowing. So people are exploiting in one way the microfinance institutions. The microcredit institutions are looking at it as business. Say for instance, if you look at the concept of microfinance, what it looks at is to build a savings habit first. Then after a period of time, when you have built a certain amount of money, then they take the next step of providing you with credit. Only when you have a certain amount of capacity to invest in a business should the actual loan for microfinance start. What is happening now is the microcredit is being provided without any of these, without savings, without a process of gradual development, the capacity of this person. So in that sense, the microcredit institutions are also exploiting the borrower.
There are some organizations who use the term microfinance for the exploitative purpose. For an example, I have come across with an organization which gives 10,000 rupee loan for 3 months, and during the 3 months period they take 3,000 as the interest, and when you calculate the effective interest rate for this loan, and it is over 200%, and it is not microfinance. The microfinance is giving credit for some useful investment purpose, and the credit should be facilitating that investment.
So based on your study, do you think that microfinance institutions are exploiting their borrowers?
What we found were that the practices, as they are now adopted by the microfinance sector, certain microfinance institutes, is very problematic. And what they are going for is actually to move away from the idea that microcredit was supposed to empower, microcredit was supposed to help the poor. Rather, what has taken precedence is the profit-making angle. So in a sense, it is in the practices themselves. So it's actually within the system of lending that there are problems.
Do you think borrowers are also being irresponsible by obtaining multiple loans to the extent that they are unable to repay them?
As to why anyone would want to blame the women, I'm not exactly clear. Because it's also then what you're missing out is to ask the larger questions. Why are women borrowing? What compels women to actually borrow even when they know that the interest rates are extremely high? So if you kind of blame one party or the other, you will never understand why, what causes or what deep-rooted causes that actually push women to borrow, and how then the microfinance institutes play a role. Why I don't want to put the blame squarely or just purely on the microfinance institutes themselves is also because within the microfinance sector, the state sector alone can't lend to the poor. So you have to have some form of private sector involvement in it. And what I think what matters here is not to blame one party or the other, but to see how the sector itself can be monitored and regulated so that neither party ends up losing out in the long term.
Many borrowers also claim that information regarding the forms they signed to obtain the microcredit facilities and the subsequent deductions made are not forthcoming in many instances. Furthermore, the forms are not always in their native language, preventing them from understanding the basic conditions of the credit facility. This was evident in the women being conversant in the installment schedule but being unable to specify the interest rate being charged by the microlenders.
They had multiple loans. Each woman had at least 2 loans. They would say, oh, okay, I think it's about 28%, and they really could not tell us specifically how much of an interest rate was being charged on their loan. Instead, what they were able to tell us was how much the daily or the weekly or the monthly installment was. And in the case of women, rarely do they get to a monthly installment. It's generally daily or weekly. So what we realized was that when these loan products are promoted among women, what the loan officers are telling them is actually how much they have to pay each day. So they really don't realize, women don't realize how high the interest rate can be. But at the same time, there is also awareness among women that the interest rate is high. So they know it's high, but they don't know the exact terms and conditions and why it is unfair. Well, I would not say why it is unfair. They also know it is unfair, but the very, I would say, like the exact way in which the interest is accrued or the way it is charged on the women, they are extremely unaware of, because that kind of information is not shared by the officers.
පෙබරවාරි මාසේ 29 වෙනිදා මම හේනට යද්දි අලියට පහු කරනවත් එක්ක ඔයාගේ අලිය දුවගෙන එන සද්දේ බැහැරලා බලන අලියාව ඊට පස්සේ මට බයිගෙන කනගන්නත් බැරිුණා. මාත්ම මේක මේ අපි ණය අරගෙන ගොඩක් කල්ලවා අපි ගෙවාගෙන ගියා මුලදී. ඒ ගෙවාගෙන ගියේ මේ සමහර අය මේ ගෑනු අය තමයි මේ එක එක කම්පැනි වලින් ඇවිල්ලා ගෑනු අය තමයි ඉස්සෙල්ලා රැස් කරගන්නේ. රැස් කරගෙන ණය දෙන සමිතියක් විදිහට හදාගෙන පස්සේ ණය දෙන්න තීරණය කරලා තමයි මේ පිරිමි අපිට දැනුම් දෙන්නේ මේ විදියයි කියලා අත්සන් කරගන්න. අදිස්සිය අපිට ඔය කන්න දෙක තුනක් උගුරු මෑරුණා දිගටම. මාස් කන්නවල් තුනක් අපිට මාස් කන්න විතරයි වැඩ කරගන්න තියෙන්නේ. ඔය මාස් කන්නවල් තුනේ මාත්‍යෝ මෑරුණාට පස්සේ මිනිහෙක් අසරණ වෙනවා ගොඩක්. දරු පවුලක් රැක ගන්නත් ඕන, ළමයි ඉස්කෝලේ අරින්නත් ඕන, ජීවත් වෙන්නත් ඕන, ණය තුරුස් ගෙවා ගන්නත් ඕන. ඔය ටික කරගෙන යන්න හම්බ වුණේ අපිට ඒ කන්න දෙක තුනම ලොකු පහරක් වැදුණා. ඊට පස්සේ ක්‍රමක්‍රමයෙන් යද්දී රජේ හිටපු මැති ඇමතිවරු කිව්වා මේ ණය ගෙවන්න එපා කපා හරිනවා. මාධ්‍ය අතින් නිවේදන අතින් හැම අතින් මේක ලෝකයට දැනුම් දුන්නා. ඊට පස්සේ ලෝකයට කල්පනා කරුවා මේ ගෙවා ගන්න බැරි ණයට නිදලා තියෙන මේ අය ආවොත් ණය ගෙනියන්න ආවොත් මිනිස්සයා කවුරු හරි අපකාරය හරි ළඟ තියාගෙන අනික් කට්ටිය අරිනවා මේ ණය හොයාගෙන එන්න කියලා අර මිනිස්සයා ඇඳේ වාඩි වෙනවා. අපි මේකට කියන්නේ ඇඳ ණය කියලා. ඉතින් අපිට මේ ණය ටික ගෙවා ගන්න ක්‍රමයක් නැහැ දැන්. ඉතින් දැම්මත් කරන්න දෙයක්වත් නැහැ. මොනවා කරන්නද? ගත්ත එක ඇත්ත. ගෙවාගෙන ගිය එකත් ඇත්ත. අසරණ වෙච්ච එක තමයි අපිට වෙච්ච ලොකුම කාර්යය. ඒ වගේ මට වෙච්ච දේම හැමෝටමත් වෙලා ඇති කියලා මම හිතනවා.
රජයෙන් දැන් ණය කපනවා කියලා කිව්වා කිසිම දෙයක් නැහැ අපිට. එහමත් ඒ සහනෙවත් හම්බුන්නේ නැහැ. ඉතින් මේ රජයෙන් ඔය කීපු සහන කාලෙත් අපේ ගෙවල් වලට අවිලා සල්ලි ඉල්ලුවා මහත්තයා. මාස රුපියල් 300 මාර හරි කමන්නේ දෙන්න කියනවා නිතරම විටිලි කරනවා.
මේ කාන්තා ව්‍යවසායක ණය කපා හරිනවා කියලා කිව්වා. ඒත් අපිට ඒකට කිසිම උත්තරයක් දුන්නේ නැහැ. ඊට පස්සේ අපි ඒවට උත්තර ඉල්ලනකොට සුදුට මූල්‍ය ආයතන නිලධාරී කිව්වේ කොහෙද තියෙන්නේ, කොමන නීතියක්ද ගෙනත් තියෙන්නේ, කොතනද තියෙන්නේ, මට ගේන්න එළිය කිවිලි කිව්වා. අපි අනන්තවත් කරුණු කාරණා පත්‍ර කෑලි වලින් කපාගෙන ගිහින් පෙන්නුවා. ඒවත් අපිට ඒ සහනයක් ලැබලා දුන්නේ නැහැ.
ඒගොල්ලන්ට ඡන්ද කාලේ දෙනවා මැති ඇමතිවරු කියනවා අපි ඔයාලට සහනයක් හදලා දෙන්නම්, කොහොම හරි ගෙවා ගන්න තියෙන ණය ටික හරි කපලා දෙන්නම්, ඔයාලට උදව් කරන්නම් කියලා. හැබැයි යාළ ඡන්දේ ගන්නවා අරගෙන යනවා. ඊට පස්සේ කවදාවත් එන්නේ නැහැ. ඊළඟ ඡන්දෙට තමයි යාළ එන්නේ.
The targeting of women as a favoured group to lend to continues within the sector. Most credit lenders rely on a single woman in each community as a focal point, whose residence then becomes a meeting and collection centre. These lenders proactively choose women and individuals who have a good history of repaying their loans, minimizing the risk to themselves and indirectly marginalizing poorer women within the community.
Keep in mind that these are issues that are already quite sensitive. We heard about women being unable to leave the house, children being really afraid when the loan officer comes because he's verbally abusing the mother. So those kinds of issues, yes, we heard. But in terms of actual incidents of sexual harassment, physical abuse, we did not actually hear any cases. But that does not mean that it does not exist also. But we are very careful that in saying that if there are such issues, we should probably refer them to the right sources for further action. But the fact that that it happens is kind of understood. But what I want to emphasize is also that there is a stigma attached to women who borrow and then who can't repay their loans. So in the community itself, some of these women are already marginalized. They are also kind of within groups. The microcredit lender will only give to a group of women. So the women kind of act as the collateral. So when it is time to collect the money, all of the women have to provide their installments at the same time. And if you don't, then other women will fall into trouble. So because of this, the woman who has taken the loan will somehow or other find a way to pay up that installment.
අපි මේ ණය ගෙවා ගන්න විදියක් නැතුව මහත්යයි ගමේ ගිහිල්ලත් අපි හැංගිලා වගේ හිටියා. අර්ජනේ හිටන් කරව උසාවි දානවා නඩු කියනවා එහෙම කියලාවල ණය අරගෙන කියලා අපිව නිකන් පහත් අත්තරම ඩබ්බත් කරලා ඉන්නේ. ඒගොල්ලන් ඉල්ලන්නේ ගෙවල් උකස් කරලා හරි ඉඩම් උකස් කරලා හරි අපිට ගෙවන්න කියන්නේ. ඉතින් මේ වෙලාවේ
Microfinance is a concept that was introduced to empower the poor and vulnerable communities. But then the latest trend seems to favor women. Why are women targeted to lend to by microfinance institutions?
If you talk to women anywhere, they will say, I don't want any debt. I don't want my name to be associated with having Naya in my name. So they will do whatever possible in order to pay off that loan. And this is at the crux of the 99% or 90% in repayment ability. Because they will somehow or other find a way, even if they don't have the money, they will borrow and then they will somehow pay. So I think those are the main reasons why women have been targeted. But the idea has always been quite a good idea, very positive idea, and that it leads to the empowerment of women. But that in itself is now questionable given the fact that it has actually reversed and women are falling into more debt.
Despite these associated problems, women continue to borrow from private and informal lending institutions, largely because of the challenges encountered in accessing the state-run banking system. While women were found to repay their loans somehow or the other, this involves compromising on their consumption, pawning gold jewellery, and borrowing from friends and relatives.
Rather worrying trend is that when women are unable to pay, let's say they have about 100,000, 150,000 rupees accrued as credit, they look for ways of paying it off somehow. So what we have found through our other research looking at migrant workers is that a lot of these women are also now trying to migrate to work overseas. Because if you're working as a domestic worker, say for instance in Kuwait or Saudi Arabia, the recruitment agents here would promise you 100,000 rupees or 150,000 rupees as a one-off payment before you go. So it's almost incentivizing you to go for work overseas. So they use that promise and that money to actually pay off the accrued debt. And that in a way is a bit worrying for us, because it also shows how vulnerable women are because of this idea that they have to somehow or other pay off the debt and clear their slate.
Microcredit lending in Sri Lanka has been supported at different stages through government interventions. Following signals of debt distress in several parts of the island, in 2018 the government decided to write off non-consumption loans up to 100,000 rupees given to women by all registered finance companies in a dozen districts. However, a majority claims that such measures were not implemented at the ground level.
நாங்கள் கூலி வேலை தான் செய்துறாங்க அப்போ அதால் எங்களுக்கு கொஞ்சம் கரைச்சல் கட்டுறது அப்படி இருந்தும் கட்டும் கொண்டு சொல்லி கொண்டிருக்கிறோம். நாங்கள் தவணை கேட்க தவணை தெரியணும் இல்லை.
இப்போ எல்லாரும் முளைப்புகளும் இல்லாமல் இருக்கணும். மற்ற பிள்ளைகளும் எனக்கு 4. அப்போ அதால் சரியான கஷ்டம் தானே, அது கட்டையிலாது.
In many instances, previous governments promised to write off the debts obtained by women, especially in rural communities. But do you think debt forgiveness is a solution to this problem?
Practically from the ground, we heard very little about the debt forgiveness measures. Women were unaware of it, and we really don't know how well that worked. But I think if you're looking at the sector as a whole, that also does not really help sustain the sector in the long run. Yes, it may help certain women and certain borrowers in the short term, but that really does not address the fact that women borrow for multiple reasons, and that we have not addressed that need.
Debt forgiveness, maybe that also had a bigger impact on the industry as a whole, because everybody was expecting, people thought that it was possible to take loans and not pay back, which is also wrong. I mean, we can argue about neoliberalism and all the concepts that go with it, but if you are taking a loan, the repayment side of it is part of it. Forgiveness needs to be taken with those things, with that particular background, that the forgiveness would relate and would end up in the industry itself collapsing and having a knock-on effect on the banking industry as well. I think it should have been approached a little bit more carefully.
How accurate are the data and statistics? In many instances, repayment was shown to be more than 90% in the microcredit lending sector, which brings us to question if repayment patterns are satisfactory. Why is there a rising problem of accumulating debt?
So if you look at what's being reported, is that the repayment is very high at 100%. But there is no indication to see whether it has generated a business, whether additional people have been employed by this particular business, or whether the repayment was made through other sources or other income sources. So none of them are shown in any of the reports. And the reports simply highlight the fact that there is 99 or even 100% repayment. And it's just a partial picture.
When we initially had discussions with women, when we asked, we used the Sinhala term, Shudranaya. And then everyone would be like, no, we don't understand what, using formal terms, technical terms was much more difficult. And then we realized that, so then they would ask, you're talking about loans, and they use the English term. So what we realized was, when they use the English term loans, they mean women actually refer to loans, microcredit, that is lent by private institutes. But if you're talking or if you're using the term Naya, that could also mean credit that is offered through state institutions such as Samurdhi. So we have to be very careful in how we refer to loans. But even within loans, they would say, you're talking about the Sati loan, or which means the weekly loan, or the bi-weekly loans. So because there are certain products that are offered to women on the ground from microfinance institutes, the terminology they use is also very different. So unless you know what terminology to use or what words to use with the women to talk about these issues, they might actually not tell you that, give you a proper picture about the number of loans that they have actually taken.
According to the Lanka Microfinance Practitioners Association, data gathered from 37 microfinance institutions in 2018 indicates a total loan portfolio of 94 billion rupees for over 2.8 million active borrowers, of which over 2.4 million were women. These microfinance institutes also serve over 2.4 million depositors and hold deposits to the value of 33.24 billion rupees.
Many are of the view that the root cause for a majority of issues in the microfinance sector is because many institutes are not registered. Do you agree with such claims?
I think at the moment that's where the public discourse has been going forward, right? Even among the practitioners, they are really concerned about unregistered institutes that are functioning without any kind of licensing. But I would also be cautious in saying that it is only the problem of the unregulated microfinance institutes. What we found from the data was that it's also the registered institutes that are finance and leasing companies that are called non-banking financial institutes that are also then to blame because of the practices that they and the shortcuts that they are adopting. It's actually putting women at risk, and the risk on the institutions themselves because the repayment might not be as high as anticipated.
An individual takes multiple loans, which is where the problem is. So I would say the issue is happening from both sides, and it's the lack of that process, that the gradual process of first saving, then going into small loans, and at some point of time, and let's say when you get to 500,000, these institutions that go through that gradual process would say, now you need to go to the formal banking institutions because you have grown to a point where we shouldn't be providing loans to you. It's that graduation not happening, and you getting this credit and nobody monitoring whether your business is happening or not, or how you are paying it back. So which is where the problem is. So it doesn't matter whether it's a registered organization or unregistered organization. The moment it's a microcredit, then it becomes a problem.
Lanka Microfinance Practitioners Association estimates that around 8,000 microfinancial institutions currently operate in the country, and according to them, most of these institutions are already registered. But the data does not reflect the ground reality, as a large number of microfinancial institutions, by some estimates amounting to thousands, continue to operate beyond the purview of any regulatory authority.
Most of these MFIs are registered, but the question is whether they are regulated. There are 4 microfinance companies regulated by the central bank, non-bank financial institute or finance companies doing microfinance, they are also regulated by the central bank, and also few banks are doing microfinance, they are also regulated by the central bank. In addition to that, the NGO Secretariat also regulates. When it comes to cooperatives are also regulated by the Cooperative Commissioner. And the Samurdhi Authority is a MFI which is regulated by the government under the Samurdhi Authority. And therefore, there are a large number of regulated institutes and different legal entities, but all these regulations are mainly for deposit taking purpose. The main activity in microfinance today is the credit. There is a significant number of MFIs who are not regulated for credit. The credit is by and large not regulated in Sri Lanka.
In 2019, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka drafted a new Credit Regulatory Act to address the issues of unregulated microfinance institutions in the country and to provide more space for customer protection. However, the new act is yet to be implemented. But the question remains, are new laws sufficient by themselves to provide a long-term solution to these issues?
First is the regulation of it, in the sense, so that needs to come into place. The second is making sure that the person who is starting off a business is actually taking it for the purpose of the business and is making money out of it. And if it is being used for consumption purposes, then it needs to be a completely different process. The culture of developing the entrepreneurial capacity needs to be there, because not everybody, you give me 100,000 or you give 100,000 is given to you, it's not necessary that you would be able to do that entrepreneurial venture.
What right now microfinance institutes are doing they are borrowing from commercial banks, which are slightly higher interest rates. In other countries in the region, there are the government supported or donor supported low interest funding. In Sri Lanka also there had been a similar initiative called National Development Trust Fund, but now it is operating under bank, which also lends on commercial rates to MFIs, and it will also be an area that government needs to come into help. And also taxes. The microfinance institutes are also taxed at the same rate as banks, but in other countries in the region, they have very, very low tax rates for MFIs.
Women borrow for multiple reasons, and that we have not addressed that need. And unless that is addressed, I think this issue will continue, especially because women told us themselves, yes, but we cannot stop borrowing. People tell us to stop borrowing, but then there are these other needs in the family that I have to respond to, that I have to make sure that the children are safe, that they have to undergo surgery, I have to find money for it. So unless those large issues are addressed,
the problem lies within many areas, and the debt crisis is only the tip of the iceberg. Even if regulatory measures are in place, laws cannot suppress vulnerable communities from borrowing to survive. Microfinance, which was once a tool to alleviate poverty, is now being used as a temporary solution to address problems that have gone unnoticed for several decades. Problems that can only be resolved at the grassroots with a proper policy response from state authorities. For the Newsfirst team, this is Zeenat Musafir.